Why did no one notice her standing there, soaked by the rain, while the city rushed past like she didn't exist? Sarah Martinez tightened her jacket as Seattle blurred around her. Wet pavement, umbrellas colliding, people brushing past her shoulder without apology. To them, she was ordinary, invisible, just another woman killing time between appointments. And that was exactly how she needed it. She stepped into the coffee shop, the warmth hitting her face like a held breath released. The barista barely looked up, a tired smile, a paper cup already moving. "Black coffee, medium," she said softly. Her voice carried no rank, no authority, just calm. As she waited, she noticed the mother near the window, exhaustion written into every movement. Two toddlers, one sugar jar tipping, white crystals scattering like broken glass. Sarah moved before thought. She knelt, cleaned, redirected a wandering child with a gentle hand. The mother's eyes welled with relief. "You're doing great," Sarah said, and she meant it. Those words had carried Soldier through worse moments than this. When the barista called her name, Sarah took the cup and left without fanfare. No one asked who she was. No one wondered why her posture never slouched, why her eyes tracked exits automatically. Outside, rain again. Pike Place Market pulsed with noise and color. She drifted through it, stopping at a bookstore that smelled like dust and memory. Military history caught her eye. The shop owner noticed. "Navy family?" he asked. "My father," she replied, "Korea." He smiled with recognition, pride layered with cost. Later, by the waterfront, she sat watching ships move like silent equations across the water. Cargo routes, distances, timelines. Her mind never really shut off. When the jogger collapsed, she was already moving. Pulse checked, airway clear, calm voice cutting through panic. She stayed with him until the paramedics arrived, delivering a report that was precise, clinical, and practiced. Too practiced for someone ordinary. "You medical?" one asked. "I've had training." That was true, just not the kind they imagined. By the time she reached the law office, the weight inside her chest had returned. This meeting would change things. David Rodriguez greeted her politely, skeptically. He spoke of fees, of prestige, of expectations. Sarah listened, then slid the card across the desk. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was stunned. "Admiral Martinez." She nodded once. "I prefer it when people don't know," she said. Outside, the sky began to clear, but inside her clouds gathered. The hearing loomed, and with it something she'd avoided her entire career. Being seen. Why did preparing to speak publicly feel more dangerous than stopping an attack no one would ever know about? The next morning, Sarah woke before dawn. Routine steadied her. Coffee from her father's old percolator, stretching, headlines scrolling silently. The call came exactly on time. "Admiral," Captain Wright said, "we have a problem." Operation Silent Harbor. The name alone tightened her jaw. Leaks, a retired general, and Dr. Elena Vasquez. Sarah stared at the photos, her former analyst, brilliant, principled, angry. "She doesn't see the whole picture," Wright said. "No," Sarah replied, "but she thinks she does." That was the danger. The operations center hummed around her, screens alive with data protecting people who would never think about it. She watched trains move through the city below. Ordinary systems, fragile systems. That's what they defended. The call with Admiral Thompson was brief, direct, heavy with implication. "Tell the truth," he said, "but carefully." At lunch, Sarah sat in a diner filled with sailors and families and noise that grounded her. This normalcy, was the point of everything she did. Did they need to know how close disaster had come? Or did they just need to live? Her sister's text buzzed her phone. "Saw your name in the news." The anonymity was cracking. That night Sarah rehearsed answers that could never fully explain the truth, because the truth wasn't neat or comforting. It was compromise. What do you say when the world wants simple answers, but reality is built from quiet, uncomfortable choices? The morning of the hearing arrived gray and cold. Sarah dressed slowly, blues pressed, ribbons aligned, each one representing something that could never be explained on television. The mirror showed an admiral. Inside, she still felt like the woman helping clean spilled sugar. The hearing room was designed to intimidate. Cameras, wood, elevation. Senator Davidson spoke of shadow governments and secrecy. Sarah listened. When she spoke, her voice did not rise. It didn't need to. She talked about prevention, about invisible victories, about success measured by what never happened. They pushed harder. Budget's proof, justification. She gave them a single example, enough truth to satisfy, not enough to endanger. The room shifted. Dr. Vasquez's testimony hit like a slow burn, emotional, convincing, incomplete. Sarah didn't interrupt, didn't react. She understood why Alina felt betrayed. But belief wasn't the same as knowledge. When Sarah responded, she didn't attack. She explained. Legal authority, oversight limits, restraint. 17 citizens surveilled, 2 cleared, data destroyed. Not perfect, but deliberate. The final question came like a verdict. Do the American people have a right to know? Sarah stood. They have a right to be safe, she said, and sometimes that safety requires trust. Silence followed. Not agreement, but understanding. Weeks later, the noise faded. The story moved on, as stories always do. Sarah returned to the coffee shop, sat where she had before. The paper mentioned convictions, no names, no accolades. She preferred it that way. A young mother struggled nearby. Sarah stood. Some things didn't change. As she walked home, she felt the familiar weight settle again. Not pride, not regret. Responsibility. Because dignity doesn't announce itself. Sometimes it just acts. Why did the calm she carried into the operations center feel heavier than fear ever had? Sarah Martinez stepped through the secured doors just after dawn, the building already alive with quiet urgency. Screens glowed, analysts murmured. Coffee cups steamed beside classified folders. To anyone else, it was a workplace. To her, it was the inside of a living organism, one that never truly slept. She felt it immediately, the shift, the tension that hadn't been there yesterday. Captain Wright was waiting. He didn't offer pleasantries. He never did when things were serious. They're circling, he said. Sarah set her bag down slowly. Who? Everyone who smells blood, oversight staffers, media analysts. A senator's aide called twice before 600. They're asking about budget lines that don't have names. Sarah exhaled through her nose, not frustration, calculation. Which operation? She asked, though she already knew. Wright hesitated, just long enough. Silent Harbor. The name settled between them like an unexploded device. Sarah didn't sit. She walked to the glass wall overlooking the operations floor. Lines of data scrolled across screens, shipping lanes, cyber alerts, satellite feeds. This was the part of the world she understood. Patterns, pressure points, consequences. Silent Harbor hadn't been loud. It hadn't been heroic. No gunfire, no flags. Just a series of decisions made faster than public process could tolerate. That was why it worked. How much do they know? She asked. Enough to be dangerous, not enough to be accurate. Sarah nodded once. That was often worse. She remembered the first briefing, 18 months earlier. The intercepted fragments, the anomaly in shipping manifests that looked like a clerical error until it didn't. The analyst who connected the dots had been Alina Vasquez. Brilliant, relentless, uncomfortable with silence. Sarah had admired her, still did. "Is Alina talking publicly?" Sarah asked. "Not yet," Wright said, "but she's filed complaints, formal ones, and she's been meeting with people who don't ask friendly questions." Sarah closed her eyes briefly, not to escape, to steady. Alina believed in exposure. Sarah believed in containment. Neither of them were villains. That was the hardest part. "Set up a secure line with Admiral Thompson," Sarah said, "and get legal in this afternoon. I want no surprises." Wright nodded, then paused. "Ma'am, this hearing, they're going to make it personal." Sarah almost smiled. "They always do." Later, alone in her office, Sarah reviewed the old files, not the summaries, the raw material, the moments before certainty when every choice felt like guessing in the dark. She remembered the night they decided to act. If they waited for visible confirmation, it would be too late. If they moved too early, they'd be accused of paranoia. So they moved quietly, joint exercises, legal warrants, coordinated silence. They stopped something terrible from happening. And now she was being asked to explain an absence. Her phone buzzed. A message from her sister, Maria. "You okay? Saw something about hearings. Call me when you can." Sarah stared at the screen longer than necessary. She typed back a careful reassurance, deleted it, typed another. "All good, just work stuff." It wasn't a lie, just incomplete. At lunch, Sarah left the building. She needed air that didn't smell like recycled urgency. She walked to a small park nearby, sat on a bench worn smooth by other people's worries. She watched a father teach his daughter to ride a bike. The girl wobbled, fell, laughed anyway. Sarah felt something tighten in her chest, not sadness, distance. Her work protected moments like this, but it also kept her apart from them. The hearing wasn't just about money or legality. It was about visibility, about whether the country still accepted guardians it couldn't see. That night Sarah went home to her modest apartment. She cooked something simple, ate standing up, old habits. She laid out documents on her table, not because she needed to memorize them, but because touching paper grounded her, made the abstract real. Her father used to say, "If you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it." She wondered what he'd say now. The next morning, the call came earlier than expected. "Admiral," Wright said, "they've added a witness." Sarah sat up straight. "Who?" "Alina Vasquez." There it was, the turn she'd been expecting but still hadn't hoped for. "Is she hostile?" Sarah asked. "Principled," Wright replied carefully, "which might be worse." Sarah ended the call and sat in silence. She didn't feel betrayed. She felt exposed. Alina hadn't seen the full picture, but she had seen enough to hurt them both. At the operations center, preparations accelerated. Legal teams drafted responses. Public affairs officers debated phrasing that wouldn't sound evasive. Sarah watched it all from a slight remove. Her mind was elsewhere. She thought of Alina late at night, staring at data that suggested lines had been crossed. She thought of her own younger self, believing that truth alone could fix things. Reality had taught her otherwise. By evening, exhaustion crept in, not physical, moral. She went for a walk, no security detail, just a jacket and the city. She needed to remember how it felt to be anonymous. At a crosswalk, a man asked for directions. She gave them. At a grocery store, she helped an elderly woman reach a shelf. Ordinary interactions, human scale. She wondered if the senators questioning her had any idea what scale their questions operated on. Back home, she called Maria. "Are you really okay?" her sister asked. Sarah hesitated, then said, "I'm about to be very visible." Maria laughed softly. "You've always hated that." "I'm not afraid of scrutiny," Sarah said. "I'm afraid of misunderstanding." There was a pause. "You've always done what you thought was right," Maria said. "That has to count for something." After the call, Sarah sat in the dark, city lights bleeding through the window. She didn't pray. She reviewed contingencies. The morning of the hearing rehearsal, she stood before an empty room, answering questions that hadn't yet been asked. Her voice stayed steady. Inside, she felt the old familiar pressure, the one that came before action. This wasn't a battlefield, but the stakes were just as real. She knew she would be asked to choose between clarity and safety, between personal credibility and institutional protection. She also knew there would be no applause at the end, no moment where it felt resolved. Some battles ended in silence. As she packed up to leave, Wright stopped her. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "whatever happens, you stop something that would have killed people." Sarah met his eyes. "I know," she said. And for the first time since the leaks began, she allowed herself to feel it. Not pride. Resolve. Because when the room filled with cameras and doubt, she wouldn't speak for herself. She would speak for the absence of disaster. For the quiet father teaching his daughter to ride a bike. For the people who would never know how close the world had come to breaking, and never needed to. Why did the silence before the hearing feel louder than any room she had ever commanded? Sarah Martinez sat alone in the backseat of the car as it moved through the gray morning, rain streaking sideways across the windows. The city felt muted, as if it knew something was about to happen and was holding its breath. She watched reflections of traffic lights smear across the glass and thought about how many times she'd entered dangerous spaces without hesitation, foreign airfields at night, rooms where trust was provisional, decisions made with incomplete information. None of those moments felt quite like this. Agent Rodriguez drove without speaking. He had learned that silence wasn't awkward to people who lived inside their own thoughts. Sarah appreciated that. The radio stayed off. No news. She didn't need to hear her name spoken by strangers yet. As the federal building came into view, she saw the crowd first. Protest signs, flags, cameras already searching for movement. People had opinions before they had facts. She understood that too. Fear needed somewhere to go. They took the underground entrance. The hallway inside smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper. Sarah adjusted her uniform automatically, fingers brushing the ribbons on her chest. Each one represented something specific. A decision, a cost, a night that never quite left her. In the waiting room, her legal team sat around a table littered with folders and half-empty coffee cups. David Rodriguez looked up, forcing confidence into a tight smile. "You're early," he said. "I like to see the room before it fills," Sarah replied. They went over last-minute reminders. Answer directly. Don't volunteer. Pause before responding. If a question crossed into classified territory, say so calmly and stop. Sarah listened, nodded, asked one clarifying question. But her attention kept drifting, not to the senators, not to the cameras, but to Alina. She hadn't seen her in person since the analyst resigned. Alina Vasquez hadn't slammed doors on her way out. She hadn't gone public. She had simply left, carrying her convictions with her like unresolved equations. Sarah remembered standing in her office that day, offering to talk, to explain what Alina didn't have clearance to see. Alina had shaken her head. "I don't want an explanation," she'd said. "I want limits." Sarah had respected that. She still did. A staffer appeared at the door. "They're ready for you, Admiral." The hearing room hit her all at once. The ceiling seemed too high, the lights too bright, the air heavier than it should have been. Senators sat elevated behind long desks, faces arranged into expressions they had practiced in mirrors. Cameras lined the walls, red lights blinking like watchful eyes. Sarah took her seat at the witness table. She placed her hands flat on the surface. Stillness was a choice. Senator Davidson opened with ceremony. Words about accountability, transparency, trust. Sarah heard them the way she heard distant thunder, acknowledging the sound without mistaking it for the storm itself. When she was sworn in, her voice didn't waver. The first questions were procedural: tenure, chain of command, budget authority. She answered without embellishment. Then they began to circle. "Admiral Martinez," Davidson said, leaning forward slightly, "you oversee operations so classified that even members of this committee struggle to obtain details. Why should the American people trust decisions they are not allowed to examine?" Sarah didn't rush her response. "Because those decisions are examined," she said. "Just not publicly. Oversight exists. Legal review exists. Accountability exists. It simply happens in places that don't make headlines." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Davidson pressed, "Isn't that convenient?" Sarah met his gaze. "It's necessary." She spoke about prevention, about threats measured in probabilities rather than certainty, about the difficulty of proving the value of something that didn't happen. She could feel the room listening, not agreeing but engaged. Then came the question she'd been waiting for. "Are you familiar with Operation Silent Harbor?" "Yes, Senator." "Did your office spend over $200 million on that operation?" "Yes." "And can you explain, in terms the public can understand, what they received in return?" Sarah felt the familiar internal pull, the instinct to explain fully battling the discipline to explain safely. "Yes," she said, "they received continuity, stability, an uninterrupted flow of goods through one of the most economically vital waterways in the country. They received safety without disruption." Davidson frowned. "That sounds abstract." "Safety often does," Sarah replied. The morning wore on, questions sharpened. Some were genuine, some were performative. Sarah answered all of them with the same steady cadence. During a brief recess, she stepped into a side room and allowed herself one slow breath. Her attorney whispered encouragement. She nodded but said nothing. She knew the real test was coming. When the hearing resumed, Senator Davidson adjusted his papers. "This committee will now hear testimony from Dr. Elena Vasquez." Sarah didn't turn around as Elena entered the room. She didn't need to. She recognized the weight shift, the subtle change in energy. Elena's voice was clear, confident, passionate. She spoke of patterns discovered, of intelligence pieced together, of the moment she realized the threat was real. Sarah felt a flicker of pride. Elena had been exceptional. Then Elena spoke of concern, of lines crossed, of secrecy becoming habit rather than exception. Sarah listened without interruption. When Elena described surveillance, the room leaned forward. Words like citizens and privacy carried weight that no classified briefing ever could. Sarah felt something tighten behind her ribs, not anger, sadness. Elena wasn't lying. She was incomplete. The senators seized on it. "Are you saying Admiral Martinez authorized illegal surveillance?" Davidson asked. Elena paused. "I'm saying the scope exceeded what I believed was justified." When it was Sarah's turn to respond, she returned to the table with a slim folder, the only one she was allowed to bring. She spoke slowly. "Dr. Vasquez is correct that the operation involved surveillance. She is incorrect in assuming it lacked legal authorization." She explained warrants, oversight limits. She didn't diminish Elena's concerns. She contextualized them. When asked directly how many Americans were affected, Sarah gave the number. 17. Not dozens, not hundreds. 17. The room shifted again. The questioning continued, but the tone changed. Less accusation, more examination. By the time the chairman asked the final question, Sarah was exhausted in a way she couldn't show. "Do you believe secrecy is compatible with democracy?" Sarah stood. "I believe secrecy must serve democracy, not replace it," she said. And I believe our responsibility is not to eliminate risk entirely. That's impossible. But to choose which risks we expose the public to and which we absorb ourselves. She paused. That's the burden of this work. When the hearing adjourned, the cameras cut. The noise rushed back in. Alina approached her afterward. No hostility, just fatigue. I didn't want to hurt you, Alina said. I know, Sarah replied. They stood there, two women who had chosen different responses to the same fear. I still think we need more sunlight, Alina said. And I think sunlight can blind as easily as it can illuminate, Sarah answered gently. Neither convinced the other. But both understood. That night, alone in her apartment, Sarah sat by the window as rain returned to the city. The hearing would dominate headlines for days. Opinions would harden. Simplifications would spread. She felt older than she had that morning, but also steadier, because she had done what she always did. She had stood between danger and normal life, not with force, but with restraint. And she knew that tomorrow, somewhere in the city, someone would be buying coffee, teaching a child to ride a bike, or walking along the water without ever knowing how close silence had come to breaking. That was enough. Sometimes the hardest strength was not in what you revealed, but in what you chose to carry alone. What happens after the camera is shut off, when the noise fades but the weight does? Sarah Martinez stood alone in the narrow corridor outside the hearing room, her hand resting against the cool stone wall. The building had emptied quickly, reporters chasing reactions, staffers rushing to spin narratives, senators disappearing into private elevators. The echo of voices lingered like aftershock. For a moment, she didn't move. She had faced interrogation rooms overseas with less adrenaline than this. Those rooms had rules she understood. This one had theater. Her attorney approached quietly. The public session's done. Closed review next week. Sarah nodded, thank you. He hesitated. For what it's worth, you were steady. That matters. She didn't answer. Steadiness wasn't the goal. Consequence was. Outside, rain fell again. Seattle never quite let anything end cleanly. As she exited through the underground garage, her phone buzzed with messages she didn't read. Headlines would already be forming, fragments of her words lifted from context, shaped into something simpler, easier to argue with. Agent Rodriguez drove in silence. As the city passed, Sarah watched people through the window, couples arguing under umbrellas, delivery drivers sprinting through puddles, a woman laughing into her phone. Life didn't pause for hearings. That was the point. At home, she hung her uniform carefully. The fabric still smelled faintly of polish and nerves. She changed into jeans and a sweater, then stood in the kitchen without turning on the lights. For the first time all day, she allowed herself to feel tired. Not the physical kind. The tired that came from explaining complexity to people who preferred certainty. She poured a glass of water and leaned against the counter. Her mind replayed Alina's testimony, not the accusations, the sincerity, the belief that exposure itself was a moral act. Sarah respected that belief. She just knew it wasn't enough. Her phone rang. Maria. Sarah answered on the second ring. Hey. I saw you, her sister said immediately, on TV. Sarah closed her eyes. I figured you might. You looked calm, Maria said, but tired. That made Sarah smile faintly. You've always been good at reading me. There was a pause. Is it as bad as they're saying? No, Sarah replied, then after a beat, and also yes. She chose her words carefully. It's not about wrongdoing, it's about discomfort. People don't like being reminded that safety isn't automatic. Maria exhaled. I don't know how you do it, carrying all that. Sarah looked around her small apartment. I don't carry it all at once, she said. I carry today. After the call, she sat on the couch and let the silence settle. The building creaked softly. Somewhere above her, A neighbor laughed. Somewhere below, music played faintly. Normal sounds. She slept poorly. Dreams came in fragments, conference rooms dissolving into open water, voices calling her name without faces. She woke before dawn and gave up on rest. Instead, she ran. The early morning air was sharp, clean. Her breath formed clouds as she moved through empty streets. Running had always been her way of thinking without words. She thought about her first command, how terrified she'd been of making the wrong call, how an older officer had told her, "You don't get certainty, you get responsibility." That lesson had followed her into every role. Back home, she showered and made coffee. The day ahead held no meetings, no briefings, for once nothing urgent, which made her uneasy. By mid-morning, the news cycle had settled into its familiar rhythm. Analysts debated her tone. Commentators questioned her philosophy. Some called her composed, others called her evasive. She turned it off. Instead, she walked. The bookstore at Pike Place was open. Henry looked up in surprise. "Back again?" he asked. "Seemed like the right place," Sarah said. He studied her face more closely this time. Recognition flickered, then faded. "I saw someone on the news yesterday," he said casually. "Reminded me of you." Sarah smiled. "That happens." They talked about books, about history, about how wars were remembered differently depending on who told the story. "Most people only see the noise," Henry said. "They forget about the quiet work in between." Sarah nodded. The quiet work is usually what matters. As she left, she felt lighter. Not because things were resolved, they weren't, but because she'd touched something real. That afternoon, a secure message arrived. Elena Vasquez requested a meeting. Sarah stared at the screen for a long time before replying yes. They met 2 days later in a neutral office, no flags, no cameras. Just a table, 2 chairs, and a pot of stale coffee. Elena looked thinner, tired in a different way. "I didn't want our last conversation to be on a record," Elena said. Sarah appreciated that. "Neither did I." They spoke carefully at first, about the hearing, about the way testimony becomes weaponized once it leaves your mouth. Then Elena asked the question she'd been holding. "Did you ever doubt Silent Harbor?" she asked. Sarah answered honestly, "Every day." Elena frowned. "Then why keep going?" "Because doubt doesn't mean wrong," Sarah said. "It means you're still paying attention." They talked about oversight, about the limits of transparency, about the fear of becoming what you once opposed. Elena admitted something then, that leaving hadn't brought the peace she expected. "I thought speaking out would make it lighter," she said, "but it just shifted the weight." Sarah nodded. "That's the part no one tells you." They didn't agree by the end, but they understood each other better, and sometimes that was enough to prevent real damage. Weeks passed. The closed session review concluded quietly. No indictments, no firings, recommendations, adjustments. Language softened. Sarah returned to work, but something had changed. Her name carried more gravity now, less anonymity. She felt it when people recognized her, when conversations paused as she entered rooms. It made her uncomfortable. One evening she stood by the waterfront again, watching ferries cut through the water. She remembered standing there months earlier, unnoticed. She missed that. But she also knew visibility wasn't always about ego. Sometimes it was about accountability, showing that there was a human face behind the decisions. She took out her phone and deleted several unread messages. Then she slipped it back into her pocket and focused on the horizon. The world kept moving. Threats would come again, questions too. And when they did, she would answer them the same way she always had, not with certainty, but with care. Because strength wasn't loud. It wasn't perfect. And it didn't need permission. Sometimes it simply stood still long enough to be seen, then went back to work. Why did the quiet after everything felt harder to manage than the storm itself? Sarah Martinez noticed the change first in small ways. Conversations stopped when she entered rooms. Jokes ended mid-sentence. Even people who had worked beside her for years now seemed to measure their words, as if she had become something fragile or dangerous. Visibility had done that. She had spent most of her career learning how to disappear into systems, how to let decisions speak instead of names. Now her name carried weight. It echoed in places she never intended it to reach. At the operations center, the work continued without pause. Threats didn't wait for political digestion. Analysts tracked signals. Liaisons coordinated quietly with foreign partners. The world still needed guarding. But Sarah felt the difference inside herself. She hesitated more, not in decision-making that remained sharp, but in the moments before and after. The reflection, the awareness that whatever she authorized now might someday be dissected by people who had never carried its cost. Captain Wright noticed. "You're second-guessing," he said one evening as they reviewed a briefing alone. Sarah didn't look up. "I'm evaluating." "That's not the same thing," he replied gently. She set the folder down. "It is when evaluation has consequences beyond the mission." Wright leaned back. "You taught me that accountability isn't fear, it's discipline." Sarah smiled faintly. "Then I taught you well." That night she stayed late. The building emptied, lights dimmed automatically, leaving only the low hum of machines. She stood before a world map, pins marking operations past and present. Each one represented a choice. Each one had prevented something. She wondered how many of those choices would survive the new appetite for exposure. Her phone buzzed, a secure message. "Unscheduled incident, Maritime Pacific Northwest." Sarah straightened immediately. The briefing came fast. A container ship flagged for irregular routing, crew changes that didn't align, financial anomalies too subtle for headlines, too loud for analysts. It was Silent Harbor. But it rhymed. "We need eyes on it," Wright said. "Quiet ones." Sarah felt the old focus settle in. This was familiar territory, not hearings, not rhetoric, reality. "Coordinate with Coast Guard and Customs," she said. "No show of force, no alarms." As the plan unfolded, Sarah felt something else: reassurance. This was why she existed in the shadows, not for praise, not for debate. For moments like this. The operation unfolded without drama. The ship was diverted under the guise of routine inspection. The anomaly resolved into something smaller than feared, but not nothing. Potential disruption, intent not yet formed. Contained. The next morning the city woke unaware. Shipping continued. Stores stocked shelves. People drank coffee and complained about traffic. Sarah watched the sun rise over the harbor and felt a familiar mix of relief and isolation. She had just done something important. No one would ever know. And now, after the hearing, that anonymity felt both comforting and endangered. Later that week, she received an invitation. A public forum, Policy Institute, discussion on transparency and security. She declined. The second invitation came with pressure, names, expectations. She declined again. The third came from Alina. "Just coffee," Alina wrote, "no audience." Sarah agreed. They met in the same small cafe where Sarah's story had begun. Alina arrived early, already seated, stirring a drink she wasn't really drinking. "You look tired," Alina said. "So do you," Sarah replied. They talked about the recent incident, not details, but patterns. Alina listened more than she spoke this time. "Do you ever think," Alina asked carefully, "that one day secrecy will collapse under its own weight?" Sarah considered the question. "I think secrecy that refuses scrutiny eventually rots," she said, "but secrecy that accepts responsibility can adapt." Alina nodded slowly. I'm still not sure where that line is. Neither am I, Sarah said. That's why we keep talking. There was no resolution, but there was less tension, less need to win. As they parted, Alina said something that stayed with her. You're not what I expected, Alina said, after the hearing. Sarah smiled. Neither are you. That weekend, Sarah visited her father's old house. It had been empty since his death, waiting for a decision she kept postponing. Dust hung in the air. The place smelled like oil and wood and memory. She sat at the kitchen table where he used to read the paper, ran her fingers over old scratches in the surface. He had believed in service without spectacle, in fixing things quietly. She wondered what he would think of her now. In the garage, she found his toolbox, still organized, still ready. She picked it up and felt something loosen inside her chest. Legacy wasn't about recognition. It was about continuity. Monday brought another briefing, another potential risk, another decision. Sarah took it in stride. But that evening, as she walked home, she noticed something new. A young woman recognized her, hesitated, then approached. "Excuse me," she said. "You're Admiral Martinez, right?" Sarah braced herself. "Yes." "I just wanted to say, I watched the hearing. I don't understand everything you do, but you didn't sound like someone hiding something. You sounded like someone carrying something." Sarah swallowed. "Thank you." The woman nodded, then walked away, leaving Sarah standing on the sidewalk longer than necessary. It wasn't applause, but it mattered. That night, Sarah wrote in a notebook she rarely used. Not reports, not memos. Thoughts about power, about restraint, about how leadership wasn't about visibility, but about what you absorbed so others didn't have to. She closed the notebook and turned off the light. The world would keep questioning. That was healthy. Threats would keep forming. That was inevitable. Her role was to stand between those two truths, not loudly, not perfectly, but persistently. As sleep finally came, Sarah understood something she hadn't before. Redemption didn't come from being forgiven. It came from continuing anyway. From choosing care over comfort. From doing the work, even when the world was watching and when it was. And tomorrow, whether seen or unseen, she would wake up and do it again. Why did the end of the road feel less like an ending, and more like a quiet return to who she had always been? Sarah Martinez woke before her alarm, the city still wrapped in early darkness. For a moment she lay still, listening, pipes settling, distant traffic, a gull crying somewhere near the water. These were the sounds she trusted. They meant continuity. They meant the world was still moving forward without needing her to announce herself. She rose, dressed simply, and stood by the window as the first hint of light crept into the sky. The hearing felt like it belonged to another lifetime now. The headlines had moved on. The outrage had found a new home. That was how it always went. What lingered was quieter. A memo waited on her tablet. The closed session review's final language had been approved. No disciplinary action, structural recommendations, a reminder of balance. It was the kind of outcome that satisfied no one completely, which, in her experience, usually meant it was honest. She forwarded it to Captain Wright with a single line: implement. At the operations center later that morning, the atmosphere felt different. Not tense, focused. People met her eyes again. Conversations resumed. The machinery of work absorbed her presence instead of reacting to it. That mattered more than public opinion ever could. During the morning briefing, a junior analyst hesitated before speaking. Sarah noticed immediately. "Go on," she said. The analyst straightened. "I just wanted to say, seeing you testify, it helped. It reminded me why process matters." Sarah nodded. Process is how we make sure we don't become what we're protecting against. The analyst smiled, relieved, and continued. The moment passed, but it stayed with Sarah longer than she expected. Leadership wasn't about convincing everyone. It was about steadying the room. Later that day, Sarah took a walk during lunch. No escort, no destination. She found herself at the waterfront again, watching ferries trace familiar paths across the bay. The water reflected the sky in fragments, never holding a single shape for long. A man nearby was teaching his son how to tie a knot. The boy struggled, fingers clumsy, frustration rising. The man didn't take over, he waited. Let the boy fail, then try again. Sarah smiled. That was trust. Her phone buzzed, a message from Alina. I'm leaving the city, teaching position, not policy, students. Sarah read it twice, then replied, that sounds right. Alina responded almost immediately. Thank you for listening, even when we disagreed. Sarah typed, erased, then sent. The disagreement was the point. They would likely never fully agree, but they would both keep trying to protect something fragile in their own ways. Democracy was built on that tension. Security lived inside it. That evening, Sarah attended a small, unpublicized ceremony at the Coast Guard station near the harbor. Henry's son was being recognized for a rescue that had gone unreported beyond local logs. 6 lives saved. No cameras. No speeches beyond what was necessary. Sarah stood in the back, unnoticed. She watched the young man accept the plaque with an embarrassed smile, his father's pride unmistakable. When the applause faded, life simply continued. Afterward, Henry spotted her. Didn't expect to see you here, he said. Some work deserves witnesses, Sarah replied. He studied her more closely this time. You've had a heavy few weeks. Sarah nodded. You could say that. Henry smiled gently. My son once asked me if it bothered me that no one knew what he did. I told him, if they're alive to not know, that's the reward. Sarah felt something settle inside her chest. That night back in her apartment, she packed a small box, not for moving, for letting go. Old notes, draft speeches she never gave, a uniform ribbon that had been replaced years ago. She didn't throw them away. She labeled the box and slid it into the closet. Memory mattered, but it didn't need to be on display. Before bed, she opened the notebook again, wrote one final page. Not about operations. About restraint. About the cost of choosing silence in a world that rewarded noise. About how strength wasn't measured by how loudly you defended yourself, but by how consistently you defended others. The next morning, Sarah returned to the coffee shop. Same counter, same smell, same worn tables. She ordered black coffee, medium. The barista smiled, rough week. Sarah chuckled softly, something like that. She took her cup and noticed a young woman nearby struggling with a stroller and a spilled bag. Without thinking, Sarah stood and helped gather the scattered contents. The woman looked up grateful. Thank you. Of course, Sarah said. As she stepped back into the drizzle, coffee warming her hands, no one followed her. No one asked her name. She walked toward the market, blending into the flow of people. Just another woman navigating a wet morning. Just another citizen protected by systems she would never see. Sarah paused at the edge of the waterfront and watched the ferries again. She thought of the hearing room, the questions, the accusations, the moments of doubt. She thought of the quiet victories that would never be debated on television. And she understood something fully at last. Her redemption hadn't come from being believed. It had come from being consistent, from choosing responsibility over recognition, from standing still when the world demanded spectacle. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It doesn't explain itself or demand understanding. Sometimes it simply acts, quietly, deliberately, so others never have to know how close the world came to breaking.